The year is 1811, and the world is asleep. Not in a literal sense, but in its understanding of time itself. Walk into any church in England, open any textbook, listen to any learned professor at Oxford, and they will all tell you the same immutable fact. The earth is exactly 6,000 years old. God created the beasts of the field on the sixth day, and since God makes no mistakes, no animal has ever vanished. The concept of extinction is not just scientifically unknown, it is blasphemy. It implies the Creator is imperfect. But on the stormy, treacherous cliffs of Lyme Regis, a 12-year-old girl is about to drag a nightmare out of the mud and shatter that divine timeline forever. History preferred to forget Mary Anning. It preferred to remember her as a quaint peasant girl selling curiosities to tourists. But let us look at the archives, at the grit under her fingernails. Mary was not a hobbyist, she was a survivor.
Her father, a cabinet maker who died leaving the family in destitute debt, taught her the dangerous trade of curios hunting. These cliffs, the Blue Lias, are unstable. They are deadly. One wrong step, one sudden landslide caused by the relentless English rain, and you are buried. Yet this is where Mary stood, day after day, scanning the gray stone for a glint of bone. It was her brother Joseph who found a skull first, a foot-long beast that looked like a crocodile, but wasn't. But it was Mary, at just 12 years old, who spent months painstakingly chipping the rest of the skeleton from the rock. Imagine the scene, a child, battered by wind and sea spray, revealing a creature that no human eye had ever seen. It was 17 feet long. It had paddles instead of legs. It had eyes the size of dinner plates. The locals called it a crocodile, but Mary knew better. This was a monster from a world before man.
When the skeleton was finally revealed, it didn't just confuse the locals, it terrified the establishment. This creature, later named Ichthyosaurus, or fish lizard, was the first undeniable proof of a previous world. It was the physical evidence that would eventually force humanity to accept the concept of deep time. But here lies the tragic irony that defines Mary Anning's life. She held the key to the history of the planet in her hands, but she could not eat prestige. The Anning family was starving. They didn't have the luxury of philosophical debates or scientific glory. They needed bread. So Mary did the only thing she could. She sold the dragon. She sold the most significant biological discovery of the century to a local lord for £23. It was a transaction that set the precedent for her entire life. She would do the work, she would take the risks, she would unearth the secrets of the earth, and then she would hand them over to wealthy men who would carry them into the halls of fame where she was forbidden to enter. The Ichthyosaurus made its way to London, where it was studied by gentlemen who had never touched a chisel in their lives. They marveled at God's mystery, while the girl who found it went back to the dangerous cliffs, scanning the mud, forgotten by the very history she had just rewritten. The erasure had begun.
We move to 1823. Mary Anning is no longer a child. She is a woman of 24, and she has become the sharpest eye in Europe. While the gentlemen of science sat in their leather armchairs in London, theorizing about the flood, Mary was out in the rain, proving them wrong. In December of that year, she found something even more impossible than the Ichthyosaurus. It was a creature with a tiny head, a neck like a snake, and a body like a turtle. It was the first complete Plesiosaurus. This discovery should have made her the most celebrated geologist in the world. Instead, it triggered a systematic robbery of her intellect. The pattern was ruthless and efficient. Men like the Reverend William Buckland and Henry de la Beche, names carved into the bedrock of geology, flocked to Lyme Regis. They followed Mary like shadows.
They picked her brain. They used her anatomical knowledge to understand what they were looking at, and then they bought her specimens. And what happened next? They went back to London. They stood at the podium of the Geological Society, a club that strictly forbade women, and they presented their findings. We have the papers. We can read the transcripts. When William Conybeare presented the paper on the anatomy of the plesiosaurs, a groundbreaking work that defined the era, he barely mentioned the woman who found it, cleaned it, and explained it to him. Her name was reduced to a footnote, a mere proprietor of the fossil shop. It was intellectual theft in broad daylight. But the humiliation didn't stop at erasure. It escalated to accusation. When the sketches of Mary's plesiosaurs reached Paris, the legendary Georges Cuvier, the father of paleontology himself, declared it a fake. He said the anatomy was too bizarre, that the neck vertebrae were impossible. He essentially accused this working-class woman of cobbling together bones from different animals to scam the scientific community. Imagine the isolation. You are poor, you are uneducated, you are a woman in a man's world, and the most famous scientist in Europe calls you a fraud. But Mary didn't back down. She didn't have a degree, but she had the truth. A special meeting was called at the Geological Society to debate the fossil's authenticity. Mary, of course, was not allowed to attend. She had to wait outside the door or hear about it secondhand, while men debated the integrity of her work. In the end, Cuvier was forced to admit he was wrong. The fossil was genuine. The scientific community had to accept that this ignorant girl was right, and the great Baron Cuvier was wrong. Did they apologize? Did they offer her a membership? No. They simply continued to buy her fossils, write their papers, and build their careers on the bones she dug from the cliffs. She was the secret weapon of the Victorian geologists, the invisible engine powering their fame. In the shadow of giants, Mary Anning stood alone, covered in mud, holding the lantern that lit their way, while they did everything in their power to blow it out. Mary Anning died in 1847, at the age of 47, from breast cancer. The pain in her final years was likely exacerbated by the financial anxiety that never left her. Towards the end, the Geological Society, perhaps feeling a twinge of collective guilt or simply acknowledging that their primary source of data was dying, granted her a small annuity. It was a pittance compared to the fortunes and reputations built on her back. When she passed, her name began to fade almost immediately, dissolving like the soft limestone of her native cliffs in the rain. But culture has a strange way of preserving secrets. In 1908, a songwriter named Terry Sullivan wrote a tongue twister based on her life. You know it, we all know it. She sells seashells by the seashore. It sounds like a charming nursery. Mary Anning died in 1847, at the age of 47, from breast cancer. The pain in her final years was likely exacerbated by the financial anxiety that never left her. Towards the end, the Geological Society, perhaps feeling a twinge of collective guilt or simply acknowledging that their primary source of data was dying, granted her a small annuity. It was a pittance compared to the fortunes and reputations built on her back. When she passed, her name began to fade almost immediately, dissolving like the soft limestone of her native cliffs in the rain. But culture has a strange way of preserving secrets. In 1908, a songwriter named Terry Sullivan wrote a tongue twister based on her life. You know it, we all know it. She sells seashells by the seashore. It sounds like a charming nursery rhyme, a rhythmic exercise for children. But listen closely now that you know the truth. It is not a rhyme, it is an epitaph. It is the only apology history gave her for decades. The shells she sells are she-shells, I'm sure.
For if she sells seashells on the seashore, then I'm sure she sells seashore shells. It reduces the woman who discovered the Jurassic Ocean, who identified the beeswax stones, who found the dimorphodon, to a simple vendor of trinkets. It masks the titan of paleontology behind the facade of a shopkeeper. This rhyme is the final insult, a trivialization of, for if she sells seashells on the seashore, then I'm sure she sells seashore shells. It reduces the woman who discovered the Jurassic Ocean, who identified the beeswax stones, who found the dimorphodon, to a simple vendor of trinkets. It masks the titan of paleontology behind the facade of a shopkeeper. This rhyme is the final insult, a trivialization of a life spent battling the elements and the establishment. However, the Earth does not forget, and neither does the truth. In recent years, the fog has begun to lift. We are finally scratching away the layers of patriarchal sediment to reveal the fossilized truth of Mary Anning. In 2024, the Royal Mail released stamps celebrating her discoveries. Hollywood has started to tell her story, not as a side character, but as the lead. The Natural History Museum in London, which houses her Ichthyosaurus and Plesiosaurus, now proudly displays her name where it always belonged, right next to the specimens. We must understand that Mary Anning didn't just find bones, she found time.
She forced a rigid, dogmatic world to look into the abyss of the past and accept that monsters were real. She was the first to look a Jurassic dragon in the eye. The men of the Geological Society may have written the books, but Mary Anning read the earth. Today, we return her name to the record. We strike out the gentleman who claimed her glory and write Mary Anning in bold ink. She was not just a seller of seashells, she was the mother of paleontology. And though history tried to delete her, the creatures she found, those stone dragons of Lyme Regis, stand as eternal, silent witnesses to her greatness. She found the first Jurassic monster, and now, finally, the world found her.